In the late 1800s, California depended on winter. Not gold, not oil, not electricity, winter. Because every summer drink in San Francisco, every shipment of fruit leaving the Central Valley, and every miner working 2,000 feet underground depended on one thing: ice. And that ice only existed for a few weeks each year. When the ponds and lakes in the Sierra Nevada froze solid, men rushed onto them and harvested the surface like wheat, cutting enormous blue blocks from the earth itself. They stacked it 40 feet high in sawdust-lined warehouses. They shipped it by rail. They fought over it. They monopolized it. And for a few decades, frozen water quietly powered California's growth. This is the story of the Sierra Nevada ice industry. Before California harvested ice, it bought it. In 1850, nearly all of the ice used in San Francisco came from Boston. It was cut from frozen ponds in New England, loaded onto ships, and sent more than 15,000 miles around Cape Horn. By the time it arrived, it sold for about $12.50 per 100 pounds. In today's money, that's about $500 for ice. Boston dominated the market until 1852, when the Sitka Ice Company was founded and began shipping ice from Alaska. Alaska was closer, faster, and cheaper. Sitka Ice was selling for about $10 per 100 pounds and took control of much of California's supply. And then, in 1853, competition appeared. The California Ice Company entered the market and began buying Boston ice themselves, undercutting prices at about $7 per 100 pounds. A price war followed. Sitka responded by dropping its price to $5 per 100 pounds. They sold at a loss to kill off the competition, and in 1856, they bought out California Ice Company entirely. Once that competition was gone, Sitka raised the prices back up to $10 per 100 pounds. Control restored. But it was still dependent on ships. Meanwhile, every winter, the Sierra Nevada froze solid, and everyone knew it. Lakes and mill ponds froze in up to 16 inches thick of clear blue ice. California wasn't short on supply. It was short on transport. Before the railroad crossed the mountains, Sierra ice was just a dream. But once trains reached the Sierra in the late 1860s, that changed. And within a few years, California stopped relying on imported ice. It started cutting its own. By the early 1870s, if you wanted to see the ice business up close, you went to Boca. Boca sits along the Little Truckee River, about 20 miles northeast of Truckee. Today, you drive past it on I-80 and you don't even realize a full industrial town once stood there. It wasn't built for the views. It was built for the cold. The first settlers showed up in 1868 when the Boca Mill and Ice Company fired up operations. And they picked the spot for one reason: winter. Temperatures dropped 20 below zero like it was normal. Most towns would call that miserable, but Boca, they called it opportunity. They dammed the Little Truckee and created a mill pond about 180 acres wide. In the summer, it held logs, but in the winter, it froze solid. That pond became a factory floor. 6 big old ice houses stood by that could hold thousands of tons each. The ice would be cut from the pond, floated 200 yards down a canal, hauled up a tramway, and packed in with sawdust, stacked 40 feet high like a frozen skyscraper laid on its side. By 1872, Boca was shipping more ice, more wood, and more shingles than anywhere between San Francisco and Omaha. Now, the workers. Most of the men cutting ice weren't professional icemen. They were lumberjacks. In the summer, they cut trees, but in the winter, they cut water. Ice season didn't last long, sometimes a week, maybe a month, if conditions were perfect. When it froze, you had to move fast. Days started at dawn, ended when there was no light left. It paid $3 a day, room and board included. And that was decent money. So how did they actually do it? First, you didn't just walk onto a frozen lake and start cutting. If it was a mill pond like Boca's, it had been full of logs all summer. So step one, clear the pond. Timber had to be moved out. Floating debris had to be boomed off to the side. You wanted a clean surface before winter locked it all up. And then you waited. The first skim of ice didn't really count. They waited until it hit about 10 inches thick. And that could take a month after the first freeze. And once it was thick enough, the real work started. By the way, snow is the enemy. Snow insulated the ice. It slowed the thickening and made it cloudy when it refroze. So crews had to remove it by hand at first because horses were too heavy for the thinner ice. Later, they used shaving machines that scraped the surface clean. Good ice had a blue tint to it, and it was clear enough to see into. If you had that, you had the money ice. And then came the scoring. The ice plows dragged across the surface, carving long straight lines back and forth, until the pond was divided into a perfect little grid, 22 inches by 22 inches, again and again and again. Then men followed with ice saws to finish the cuts. And once it was free, each block weighed about 225 pounds on average, but some reports claim even larger blocks of like 600 and 700 pounds. Either way, you weren't lifting it alone. The blocks were pushed into channels by floating, and you would just poke and guide it. If the ice house was downhill, which most were, gravity just did the rest. But otherwise, the blocks floated down the canals, sometimes a couple hundred yards, straight towards the storage. But if the ice house sat higher than the pond, they used what were called dog belts, continuous moving dividers that pulled the ice upward, basically a conveyor belt. Inside the ice house, the blocks were stacked and separated with sawdust, layer after layer. The buildings were massive, often 200 feet long, and ice was stacked 40 feet high. Packed tight, sealed in. Done right, that ice could last 2, sometimes 3 years. It was cut in January, still solid in July, still cold in September. That's how you move winter into summer. A harvest day started before sunrise. You'd step out onto the pond in the dark. Lantern light, breath hanging in the air. Everything quiet, except boots scraping across the frost. First thing you checked was thickness. If it was good to go, the plow started. Long, straight lines cut across the surface, back and forth, turning a frozen pond into a perfect grid. By mid-morning, the sound changed. Steel saw teeth biting into the ice. And when the first block broke free, men guided it with pike poles into the channel, one after the other. Blue squares sliding across the water. By the afternoon, the canal was full. Blocks drifting toward the ice house, hauled up the tramway, and stacked 40 feet high. Then came the sawdust. It was used for insulation and separation. Sawdust traps air, and trapped air slows melting. So every layer of ice was separated and packed tight with it. Floor to ceiling, wall to wall. Done right, that ice could really last 2, sometimes even 3 years. Cut in January 1875, still solid in July 1876, still cold when someone in San Francisco drops it into a glass of water in September of 1877. And none of it stayed in Boca. 2,000 feet underground in Nevada, men were working the Comstock Lode in Virginia City, and rock temperatures could easily get up to 125 degrees. And after 15 minutes underground, miners were issued ice water, not as a luxury, but as for survival. Some operations allocated as much as 95 pounds of ice per miner per day. In 1872 alone, mines along the Comstock consumed more than 1,000 tons. That's one mining district, and it wasn't just for drinking. Tons of ice were packed into giant blowers that forced chilled air down into the shafts, pushing back against heat that could kill a man in minutes. Basically a mine AC. Ice literally saved people's lives. And then there was agriculture. California's fruit had to cross mountains and reach Chicago or New York without rotting. Rail cars were packed with Sierra ice before heading east. Those yellow Pacific Fruit Express cars were stuffed with blocks, cut months earlier. At the summit, they were re-iced again for the long haul. Without that frozen supply chain, California agriculture doesn't scale the way it did. This wasn't about cocktails. It was about keeping miners alive on the Comstock. It was about moving fruit across a continent. It was about industry. And it all started with men standing on a frozen pond in the dark. The ice industry didn't collapse overnight, by the way. It slowly got replaced. By the 1880s, the big players saw what was coming. Artificial ice plants were improving. Refrigeration technology was creeping forward. So in 1882, after years of price wars, many of the Sierra companies joined together under one name, the Union Ice Company. Control consolidated, and for a while it worked. Ice was still being cut in Boca, still stacked, still shipped. But once mechanical refrigeration became reliable, winter was no longer required. You didn't have to wait for that 10 inches. You didn't have to clear the snow. You didn't have to cut grids into a frozen pond. You flipped the switch. That was it. By the early 1900s, artificial plants were replacing natural harvests, and Boca's last major ice cuts came in the mid-1920s. And then, by 1939, the Boca Dam submerged what remained of that town. Today, people drive I-80 and never realize that they're passing over what used to be one of the coldest industrial hubs in California. And here's the part that's my favorite, that nobody advertises. You know horses pulled plows, right? Across those pounds. Horses left things behind. And when that happened, someone had to move fast before it froze onto the harvest. They called these guys hot tamale men. If something hit the ice, someone would yell, "Red hot!" And a young worker would run out with a wooden cart and scrape it clean before it froze solid. Because that block might end up in a San Francisco hotel or a Sacramento saloon. That was their job, cutting winter into blocks, stacking it against summer, keeping miners alive, moving fruit across the continent, and sometimes cleaning up after the horses. Before refrigeration, before electricity, California ran on ice.